The Breadwinner full movie details. Overview. The Breadwinner is an American family comedy film that comes from TriStar Pictures and is distributed worldwide by Sony Pictures Releasing. The project was first announced back in 2025, when it was reported that stand-up comedian Nate Bargatze had signed on to make his leading film debut in a brand new comedy written by himself alongside television writer and producer Dan Lagana. Because the film was originally set up and developed during 2025, many outlets and fans still refer to it as the 2025 Bargatze movie, even though its theatrical release eventually landed in 2026. The film is directed by Eric Appel, a filmmaker known for blending everyday family chaos with sharp comedic timing, having previously directed Weird the Al Yankovic Story and Die Hard the Movie. With The Breadwinner, Appel steps into a more grounded, relatable style of comedy, focusing on modern family dynamics, the pressure of parenting, and the comedic disaster that unfolds when traditional roles inside a household are suddenly flipped upside down. The movie was produced by Jeremy Latcham, Nate Bargatze, and Dan Lagana, with cinematography handled by Igel Biawilde and music composed by Leo Bernberg and Zach Robinson. It carries a production budget of around $25 million and runs for approximately 99 minutes, making it a tight, fast-paced comedy built for a broad family audience. The story is set in the United States and is entirely in English, and it was rated PG, meaning it was designed to be enjoyed by both parents and children together. At its heart, The Breadwinner is a story about identity, marriage, and parenting, wrapped inside a laugh-out-loud premise that many households can instantly relate to, especially anyone who has ever wondered what would happen if the roles in their home were completely reversed overnight. Plot details. The story of The Breadwinner centers on Nate Wilcox, played by Nate Bargatze, a hardworking salesman who has spent years being the primary income earner for his family while his wife Katie, played by Mandy Moore, manages nearly every single detail of their household. To Nate and their 3 young daughters, Katie is essentially a superhero in disguise. She keeps their home running with remarkable efficiency, juggling school schedules, meals, chores, emotional support, and the countless invisible tasks that most families never even notice are happening until they suddenly stop. Katie also happens to be incredibly resourceful, and over time she has quietly developed a clever household invention born out of pure necessity while managing her chaotic but loving family. When she gets the chance to present this invention on the reality television show Shark Tank, nobody expects what happens next. Katie's pitch becomes an unexpected sensation, and she lands a life-changing business deal right there on the show. The opportunity is incredible, but it comes with a catch, because Katie must now leave home for a prolonged business trip in order to build and scale her new venture. For the very first time, Nate is forced to become the full-time stay-at-home parent, handling 3 young daughters and an entire household completely on his own, without the safety net he never realized he was leaning on. What follows is a hilarious and heartfelt series of misadventures as Nate discovers that running a household is nothing like he imagined. He struggles with basic domestic tasks that Katie always made look effortless. He underestimates how demanding his daughters' routines truly are, and he slowly begins to understand just how much invisible labor his wife handled every single day without complaint. Throughout the film, Nate leans on a colorful group of friends and neighbors for advice and moral support, including performances from Colin Jost, Zach Cherry, Martin Herlihy, Kumail Nanjiani, and Will Forte, each of whom brings their own comedic energy to Nate's chaotic new reality. As the story progresses, the film balances big, broad comedy set pieces with quieter, more sincere moments about marriage, self-worth, and what it truly means to support a partner. Nate begins to see his wife not just as a caretaker, but as an equal partner who has sacrificed just as much, if not more, for their family's stability. Meanwhile, Katie faces her own challenges out in the business world, learning to trust her instincts and stand on her own outside the identity she built at home. By the time the film reaches its emotional and comedic peak, both Nate and Katie are forced to reevaluate what partnership really looks like, and the family ultimately comes back together with a newfound appreciation for each other's roles, proving that being a breadwinner was never just about the paycheck. Cast: Nate Bargatze leads the film in his first major leading role as Nate Wilcox, the salesman-turned-reluctant stay-at-home father who anchors nearly every scene with his signature deadpan and relatable comedic style. Mandy Moore plays Katie Wilcox, Nate's wife, whose quiet competence and sudden business success set the entire story into motion. Colin Jost, Zach Cherry, Martin Herlihy, Kumail Nanjiani, and Will Forte round out the supporting cast, playing friends, co-workers, and neighbors who each add their own flavor of chaos and comic relief to Nate's journey. Interestingly, all three of Nate Bargatze's real-life podcast co-hosts from his Nateland podcast, Brian Bates, Aaron Weber, and Dusty Slay, also make cameo appearances in the film, giving longtime fans of Bargatze's comedy an extra layer of enjoyment tucked inside the movie. Release date: The Breadwinner had a somewhat winding road to theaters. It was first reported in 2025 as an early development project, with Nate Bargatze announcing through his own social media that the film would be arriving in theaters everywhere on March 13, 2026. As production and post-production continued through the second half of 2025, the studio ultimately made the decision to shift the release window, and the film's official theatrical release date was moved to May 29, 2026 in the United States, with certain international markets, including the Philippines, opening just a couple of days earlier on May 27, 2026. The film was distributed theatrically by Sony Pictures, releasing under the TriStar Pictures banner. Trailer information: Sony released the first official trailer for The Breadwinner in December of 2025, giving audiences their first proper look at Nate Bargatze stepping into a leading film role alongside Mandy Moore. The trailer leaned heavily into the fish-out-of-water premise, showing quick comedic glimpses of Nate fumbling through school drop-offs, meal preparation, and general household mayhem, while Katie thrives in her new business venture. A second official trailer followed in early April of 2026, expanding on the family dynamic and giving a clearer look at the supporting cast, while continuing to build anticipation ahead of the film's theatrical release. Both trailers were designed to highlight the film's family-friendly tone while showcasing Bargatze's comedic timing, translating from stand-up and television into a full-length feature film. Full explanation: What makes The Breadwinner stand out is not just its comedic premise, but the way it taps into something genuinely relatable for a huge number of households around the world. The idea of role reversal within a marriage is not new to cinema, but the film approaches it through a very modern lens, using the viral, high-pressure world of Shark Tank as the catalyst rather than a slow, expected transition. This gives the story urgency and unpredictability, since Katie's success is sudden and life-altering rather than something the family had time to plan for. For Nate Bargatze, this film represents a significant career milestone. Known primarily as one of the most successful stand-up comedians working today, with sold-out arena tours and widely praised comedy specials, The Breadwinner marks his first true attempt at carrying a major studio film as the lead actor. His comedic voice, built around dry, understated delivery and everyman relatability, translates naturally into the character of Nate Wilcox, a man who is confident and capable in his professional life but completely out of his depth once he is thrust into full-time parenting and household management. Mandy Moore, on the other hand, brings a grounded warmth to Katie that keeps the film from tipping too far into pure slapstick. Her performance ensures that Katie never feels like a side character defined only by her husband's struggles, but instead comes across as a fully realized woman stepping into a new chapter of her own identity and ambition. Director Eric Appel, who has experience blending mockumentary-style humor with genuine heart, uses that same sensibility here, allowing the film to poke fun at everyday parenting struggles without ever mocking the difficulty of the work itself. In many ways, The Breadwinner functions as a loving tribute to stay-at-home parents and primary caregivers everywhere, using comedy as a vehicle to highlight just how demanding and undervalued that role often is, especially when someone experiences it for the very first time with zero preparation. The supporting cast, filled with recognizable comedic talent, ensures that even the smaller moments in the film carry weight and laughs, while the inclusion of Bargatz's real-life podcast co-hosts and cameo roles adds a fun layer of authenticity for fans who already follow his career closely. While the film ultimately received a mixed reception from critics upon release and had a modest performance at the box office, it still resonated with many family audiences who appreciated its light-hearted tone, its willingness to explore modern marriage dynamics, and its overall message about mutual respect between partners. Whether viewed purely as a comedy or as a deeper commentary on domestic labor and partnership, The Breadwinner offers a story that many people, regardless of background, can see reflected in their own homes in one way or another. The Breadwinner Complete Story. The story of the breadwinner opens on a life that looks, from the outside, almost perfectly balanced. Nate Wilcox is a salesman at a busy car dealership, and he is very good at his job. He has a natural charm, an easy smile, and the kind of confidence that makes strangers trust him within minutes of shaking his hand. Every month he climbs closer to the top of the sales board, and every month his manager reminds him how valuable he is to the dealership. At home, his wife Katie Wilcox runs an entirely different operation, one that never shows up on a leaderboard and never earns a trophy, yet is far more demanding than anything Nate faces at work. Katie is the mother of their 3 daughters, Gracie, Hadley, and Sam, and she manages every single detail of their household with the kind of precision that Nate has never once had to think about. She knows which daughter hates which vegetable, which one needs to be woken up twice, which one has a secret fear of thunderstorms, and which one will absolutely fall apart if her socks feel wrong inside her shoes. Nate walks through the front door every evening to a warm meal, clean laundry, and 3 happy, well-adjusted children, and for years he has simply assumed that this is how things are supposed to be, without ever truly asking himself how much invisible effort goes into making it look so effortless. What Nate does not fully appreciate, at least not yet, is that Katie has spent years quietly building something of her own on the side, squeezed into the tiny cracks of time between school runs, meal prep, and bedtime routines. Out of pure necessity, born from the chaos of raising 3 young girls, she has designed and refined a clever household invention that she calls the Star Minder. It began as a simple fix for a simple problem, something she cobbled together late at night to make her own life easier, but over time it evolved into something genuinely useful, something she believes other exhausted parents would want in their own homes. She never expected it to go anywhere beyond her own kitchen table, but a close friend eventually convinces her to apply for a spot on the reality television show Shark Tank, where entrepreneurs pitch their ideas to a panel of wealthy investors in hopes of landing a life-changing deal. Katie almost does not go through with it. The idea of standing in front of cameras and business moguls, pitching an invention she made out of desperation rather than ambition, terrifies her. But she flies out, walks into the tank, and delivers her pitch with a nervous energy that somehow reads as authenticity rather than weakness. The sharks are intrigued. They ask sharp questions about manufacturing costs and market size, and Katie answers with the kind of practical, lived-in knowledge that only comes from actually needing the product herself. By the end of the pitch, to her own shock, she walks away with an offer, a real deal, from a shark willing to invest serious money into scaling the Star Minder into a proper business. The celebration at home is loud and joyful. Nate is genuinely thrilled for his wife, hugging her tightly, telling her how proud he is, insisting that this is exactly the kind of thing she deserves after years of holding the family together without any recognition. The girls do not entirely understand what a Shark Tank deal means, but they understand that their mother is happy, and that is enough to make them cheer along with her. For one evening, everything feels like pure celebration, a family high on possibility and pride. Then the practical reality sets in. In order to actually get the Star Minder into production, Katie needs to travel to South Korea, where a manufacturing partner has agreed to begin building the first batch of units. It is not a quick trip. She will be gone for 2 full weeks, overseeing the earliest and most delicate stages of production, making sure the factory understands exactly what she needs and how the product should function. 2 weeks does not sound like much on paper, but neither Nate nor Katie has ever been apart from each other and the girls for anywhere close to that long. Katie is torn between excitement for her business and guilt over leaving her daughters, while Nate quietly starts to realize what her absence is actually going to require of him. He will need to take a leave of absence from the dealership, stepping away from the sales floor where he has built his entire identity, in order to become, for the very first time in his life, a full-time stay-at-home father. At first, Nate treats the whole arrangement almost like a game, a temporary role he can simply slide into using confidence and charm the same way he closes a car sale. He tells his coworkers it will be easy, tells Katie not to worry about a thing, and waves goodbye at the airport with the breezy assurance of a man who has genuinely no idea what he is about to walk into. The moment Katie's plane takes off, however, the illusion begins to crack almost immediately. The very first morning alone, Nate cannot find a single matching sock in the entire house, burns breakfast so badly that the smoke detector becomes a recurring character in its own right, and completely misjudges how long it actually takes to get 3 girls of different ages dressed, fed, and out the door for school. He arrives at pickup either far too early or agonizingly late, confuses which daughter has which extracurricular activity on which day, and discovers, to his horror, that laundry does not simply clean itself while he is busy doing something else. As the days pass, Nate's confidence erodes piece by piece under the sheer relentless volume of small tasks that Katie always handled without complaint. He learns that Gracie needs her hair braided a very specific way or she will refuse to leave the house, that Hadley is working on a school project that requires daily attention, and that Sam, the youngest, seems to test every boundary Nate tries to set, almost as if she can sense that her father does not yet know what he is doing. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, homework, bath time, bedtime stories, and the 100 tiny emotional check-ins that keep 3 children feeling secure all pile on top of each other in a way that Nate never anticipated. He starts the process thinking of parenting as a checklist to be completed, and slowly begins to understand that it is instead an ongoing, ever-shifting relationship that never actually finishes for the day. In the middle of this steep learning curve, Nate begins to build an unlikely support system around him. Peter, a friendly neighborhood delivery driver, becomes something of an accidental confidant, showing up at the door so frequently with packages that he and Nate start swapping stories and advice on the porch. Peter is warm, easygoing, and strangely wise about the small rhythms of domestic life, offering Nate little tips about the neighborhood and the school schedule that actually prove useful. Then there is Keegan Jones, a contractor hired to handle a few repairs around the house, who turns out to be far more enthusiastic than skilled. Keegan means well, and his friendship with Nate grows quickly, but almost every project he touches ends up slightly more broken than when he started, a running joke that the film uses again and again to build toward its most chaotic sequence later on. Not every new relationship comes easily. Connor Ashford, another father in the neighborhood who has been a stay-at-home dad for years, makes several genuine attempts to reach out to Nate, offering advice, inviting him to join a loose group of local parents, and generally extending the kind of camaraderie that Nate desperately needs but does not yet realize he needs. Nate, however, is proud, a little embarrassed about his own struggles, and not ready to admit weakness to a man who seems to have this whole stay-at-home parenting thing figured out effortlessly. He brushes Connor off more than once, sometimes politely and sometimes less so, unaware that this rejection is going to matter a great deal later in the story. Just as Nate starts to feel like he might be finding some kind of rhythm, his own parents enter the picture, adding an entirely new layer of chaos. When he calls his mother for help, it is his father, Brett, who actually shows up, and Brett's presence brings its own unique brand of disruption. He drifts through the house with a relaxed, almost sleepy energy, more likely to be found dozing on the couch than actively helping with the girls, and he has a habit of leaving small messes wherever he goes, as though tidying up were a concept that simply never occurred to him. Nate, already stretched thin, now finds himself managing his own father on top of everything else, a reversal of roles that becomes both comedic and quietly poignant, since it hints at where some of Nate's own blind spots about domestic responsibility may have originated in the first place. Just when Nate starts to believe he can see the light at the end of the 2-week tunnel, Katie calls with unexpected news. The Star Minders production schedule has been pushed forward, which means that instead of coming home to stay, she needs to fly almost immediately to San Francisco for another 2-week stretch to meet with the primary investor and finalize critical details of the launch. There is a brief, aching reunion at the airport, filled with hugs and a fast, guilty catch-up on everything that happened while she was away. But almost before Nate can fully process having her back, she is gone again, off to the next leg of her whirlwind new business life. This second departure hits Nate differently than the first. The initial 2 weeks could be treated as a temporary emergency, something to survive through sheer willpower and improvisation. A second stretch, arriving right on the heels of the first, forces Nate to confront the fact that this is not a short-term inconvenience but potentially a genuinely new phase of his life. Rather than spiraling into despair, though, Nate experiences a quiet turning point. He decides that trying to imitate Katie's exact methods, her routines, her specific systems for managing the household, is setting him up to fail, because he is not her and never will be. Instead, he resolves to find his own way of doing things, even if his way looks nothing like hers. What follows is a stretch of the film that leans fully into big, loose, comedic parenting improvisation. Nate makes a chaotic supply run to Walmart, filling the cart with whatever seems useful in the moment rather than following any kind of careful meal plan, coming home with an odd assortment of snacks, gadgets, and quick-fix solutions. When Sam starts having a rough patch at school, struggling socially with the other kids, Nate's solution is wonderfully, absurdly overboard. He brings an actual horse into the neighborhood, convinced that giving Sam something exciting and unusual to talk about will help her connect with her classmates. It is the kind of solution that could only come from a man who has never read a single parenting book but genuinely loves his daughter and is desperate to help her feel better. Alongside the horse experiment, Nate also introduces a new rewards-based chore system in the house, hoping that turning household tasks into a kind of game will make the girls more cooperative and take some of the daily grind off his shoulders. For a little while, incredibly, his unconventional hands-on approach seems to be working. The house is louder and messier than it ever was under Katie's system, but the girls are laughing more, and Nate starts to feel, for the first time, like he might actually be good at this. That fragile sense of balance is tested hard when 2 important events land on the exact same day. Hadley has been working for weeks toward a school spelling bee, and it means everything to her, while Nate simultaneously has a major work-related obligation demanding his presence at the same time. Torn between showing up for his daughter and showing up for the career identity he has spent years building, Nate is forced to make an impossible choice, and the tension of that decision weighs on him even as he tries to juggle both commitments. When he finally does make it home, worn out and stretched thin, he walks in to find Gracie, Hadley, and Sam in the middle of throwing a small impromptu party of their own, a burst of chaotic, unsupervised fun that neither confirms nor denies whether his balancing act is actually working. It is a moment that captures the entire theme of the film in miniature, the constant, exhausting, sometimes comedic tug-of-war between being present for your children and being responsible for everything else life demands at the same time. The film's most explosive comedic set-piece begins with heartbreaking news that turns out to be a misunderstanding. Keegan comes to Nate, distraught, believing that his beloved horse has died overnight. In a rush of sympathy and a desire to help his friend handle the situation quickly and quietly, Nate agrees to help move the animal's body before the girls can see it, and become upset. What neither of them accounts for is the simple biological fact that horses often sleep standing up, meaning the horse is very much alive, merely deeply asleep, when Nate and Keegan attempt to move it. The moment they touch the animal, it startles violently awake, and pure chaos erupts. The panicked horse bolts directly into the house, crashing through walls, scattering furniture, knocking over lamps and picture frames, turning the carefully rebuilt sense of order Nate had constructed into an absolute disaster zone in a matter of seconds before finally escaping into the night, leaving the family home looking like it survived a small natural disaster. Standing in the wreckage of what used to be his living room, stress finally overtakes Nate completely. Weeks of pressure, exhaustion, self-doubt, and the sheer accumulated weight of trying to do right by his family boil over into one impulsive, frustrated kick of a nearby ball. The ball rockets upward and slams directly into a section of roof that Keegan had, with his usual overconfidence, patched together during one of his earlier well-meaning but poorly executed repair projects. The already weakened structure gives way, and the roof partially collapses, adding structural damage on top of the horse-related devastation. It is, without question, the lowest and most chaotic point of Nate's stay-at-home experience, a literal collapse of the house mirroring the way he feels his ability to manage everything has also collapsed. The timing could not be worse, because Katie's business has scheduled an important live stream event for the Starminder, set to broadcast live from what her business partner and audience believe will be the warm, welcoming Wilcox family home. Katie plans to feature the house, the family, the very domestic world that inspired her invention in the first place, as the emotional backdrop for this major product moment. Except that home, at this exact moment, resembles a demolition site rather than a cozy family residence. Nate is faced with an impossible problem and only hours to solve it, and it is at this precise moment that his earlier, prideful rejection of Connor Ashford comes back around in the most meaningful way. Swallowing his pride completely, Nate goes to Connor and asks, humbly and honestly, whether he can borrow his house for the live stream, finally admitting how badly he has needed help and how wrong he was to keep pushing away someone who only ever wanted to be a friend. Connor, to his credit, agrees, and what follows is one of the film's most purely joyful sequences, a full team effort as Gracie, Hadley, Sam, Nate's father Brett, Peter the delivery driver, and Keegan the contractor all pitch in together to hastily transform Connor's house into a convincing stand-in for the Wilcox home. Furniture gets rearranged, family photos get temporarily relocated, small personal touches get added in a rush, all in a race against the clock before Katie's live stream goes live. Somehow, through sheer improvised teamwork, they pull it off just in time, and the broadcast begins with Katie beaming from thousands of miles away, believing she is looking at her own living room, completely unaware of the frantic scramble that made the illusion possible. The deception holds for a while, long enough for the live stream to build real momentum and genuine excitement among viewers and Katie's investor. But nothing this elaborately improvised can hold together forever, and the truth comes out in the most unpredictable way possible, when Connor's own wife and child arrive home in the middle of the broadcast, completely unaware that their living room has been temporarily repurposed as a movie set for someone else's business pitch. Their sudden, confused appearance on camera instantly unravels the entire ruse in front of Katie, her investor, and everyone watching online. For a moment it looks like total disaster, the kind of humiliating collapse that could sink both the live stream and Katie's fragile new business relationship at once. But instead of trying to cover up the lie further or make excuses, Nate does something braver. He steps in front of the camera and simply tells the truth, admitting that the house was destroyed, admitting the chaos of the past several weeks, and using the moment to say something he had never quite managed to say clearly before, a heartfelt, public apology to Katie for ever taking her daily work for granted, paired with genuine, unguarded admiration for everything she has carried for their family without complaint for years. It is raw, unscripted, and completely sincere, standing in sharp contrast to the carefully staged version of home life the live stream was originally meant to present. rather than destroying the moment, that honesty becomes the most compelling part of the entire broadcast. Viewers respond strongly to the emotional authenticity of it, the messy, human reality breaking through the polished business pitch, and the live stream ends up drawing far more attention and goodwill than a picture-perfect version ever could have. Katie, watching her husband's public apology unfold live in front of an audience, feels the distance of the past several weeks begin to close, and the emotional core of the entire film lands in that shared, unscripted moment between them. In the aftermath, both Nate and Katie step back and take stock of who they have become through this experience. Katie has proven to herself and to the world that she is capable of building something entirely her own, a business born directly out of the very domestic labor that used to go unseen. Nate has discovered, through failure, chaos, and eventually real growth, that the work Katie always did was never simple, never automatic, and never something to take for granted. By the film's conclusion, Nate makes a decisive choice, stepping away from his job at the dealership entirely to join Katie in running the Starminder together, moving into a role overseeing the sales side of her growing company. It is a symbolic and practical shift all at once, the former breadwinner choosing to build something alongside his wife rather than separately from her, embracing a more equal partnership in both the business and the home. The final stretch of the film settles into a warmer, calmer rhythm after all the chaos that came before it. The Wilcox house, eventually repaired, becomes the site of a new kind of normal, one where responsibilities are shared rather than assumed to belong to one parent by default. Gracie, Hadley, and Sam get their parents back together, both physically present and emotionally realigned, and the extended, slightly ridiculous support network Nate built along the way, Peter, Keegan, Connor, and even his easily distracted father Brett, remains woven into the family's everyday life rather than fading away once the crisis has passed. The film closes on the sense that this family did not simply survive a difficult stretch and return to exactly how things were before, but instead came out the other side changed, with both Nate and Katie understanding each other and themselves more fully than they did at the start. What makes this story resonate beyond its comedic surface is how honestly it treats the emotional weight underneath all the slapstick. The horse rampaging through the living room and the roof collapsing under a frustrated kick are big, broad, laugh-out-loud moments, but they are built on top of something quietly true, the exhausting, often invisible reality of full-time caregiving, and how easy it is to underestimate that work until you are forced to live inside it yourself. Nate's journey is never framed as him becoming a hero for doing what Katie had already been doing for years, and the film is careful never to treat his temporary struggle as more impressive than her sustained, ongoing effort. Instead, the story uses his stumbling, chaotic learning curve to make audiences see Katie's daily contributions with fresh eyes, the same way Nate himself finally does by the end. Katie's own arc runs quietly alongside Nate's louder, more visibly chaotic one. She spends the film balancing genuine excitement about her business with real guilt over the time away from her daughters, never fully at ease in either role, always aware of what she might be missing back home even as she pushes forward with something she built herself. The film resists turning her into either a guilt-ridden mother who should have stayed home or a coldly ambitious businesswoman who abandoned her family, and instead lets her simply be a full person navigating an opportunity most parents, especially mothers who have spent years as the default household manager, rarely get the chance to chase. Her success is not framed as a betrayal of her family, but as an extension of exactly the same skills, patience, resourcefulness, and quiet problem-solving that made her so effective at running the household in the first place. By the time the credits roll, the breadwinner has completed a satisfying full circle. What begins as a story about a confident, capable man being humbled by the sheer scale of domestic responsibility becomes, by its end, a story about mutual respect, shared labor, and a marriage strong enough to bend without breaking under the pressure of sudden, unexpected change. The chaos along the way, the horse, the collapsed roof, the frantic house swap, the accidental exposure during a live broadcast, gives the film its big laughs, but the quieter moments, the apology delivered without excuses, the slow realization of everything a partner does without being asked, the decision to rebuild a life around partnership rather than separate roles, are what give the story its lasting warmth. It is ultimately less a film about a man surviving 2 weeks alone with his kids, and much more a film about two people rediscovering each other by finally seeing, fully and honestly, everything the other one carries. The Breadwinner cast life histories. Nate Bargatze, who leads The Breadwinner as Nate Wilcox in his first major film role, was born on March 25, 1979, in Nashville, Tennessee, and raised in Old Hickory in a warm, devoutly Christian household that shaped much of the wholesome, family-focused tone he later became known for as a performer. His father, Stephen Bargatze, worked for years as a professional magician and clown who also taught history at Donelson Christian Academy, the same school Nate eventually attended, while his mother Carol managed tickets for Vanderbilt Commodores athletics. Nate was the middle child among 3 siblings, and some of his very first experiences performing in front of an audience came through skits at church rather than any formal training, a humble starting point for someone who would go on to sell out arenas. As a teenager, he tried his hand at track, basketball, and golf without much success, and those small, everyday failures eventually became fertile material for the self-deprecating, slower-paced comedic voice that fans now associate with him. After graduating from Donelson Christian Academy in 1997, he spent a year at Volunteer State Community College before enrolling at Western Kentucky University, where his academic career did not take off and he ultimately dropped out. In the years that followed, he worked a string of ordinary jobs, including construction, furniture delivery, shifts at Applebee's, and reading water meters back in Tennessee, all experiences that would later surface as relatable stories inside his stand-up material. In 2002, Nate and a fellow water meter reader named Michael Clay made the bold decision to quit their jobs together and move to Chicago to chase careers in comedy. Once there, Nate briefly considered improv at the Second City before deciding that stand-up suited him better, enrolling instead in Jim Roth's Comedy College and performing his first proper set in 2003. He spent time honing his craft at Chicago clubs like Zanies before relocating again in 2004, this time to New York City, where he took a job as a barker outside the Comedy Cellar to help promote shows while slowly working his way into stage time at venues such as the Gotham Comedy Club. His national television breakthrough came in 2008 and 2009 with appearances on Live at Gotham and Late Night with Conan O'Brien, and in 2011 he landed his own half-hour special, Comedy Central Presents, Nate Bargatze, built around material on everyday absurdities. After winning both the New York Comedy Festival and the Boston Comedy Festival in 2010, his profile continued to climb, and his 2012 debut album, Yelled At by a Clown, reached number 2 on the Billboard Comedy Albums chart. He continued releasing full-length specials over the following decade, including Full-Time Magic in 2015 and later The Greatest Average American, gradually building one of the most devoted fan bases in modern comedy through his clean, deadpan, almost impossibly calm delivery. His 2024 Netflix special, Your Friend, Nate Bargatze, marked a major milestone in his career, earning him a Grammy Award for Best Comedy Album and cementing his reputation as one of the biggest stand-up comedians working today, capable of selling out arenas across the country. Alongside his stand-up success, he hosted Saturday Night Live on more than one occasion, published the book Big Dumb Eyes, Stories from a Simpler Mind, and launched the Nate Land podcast with a close circle of comedian friends. On a personal level, Nate married Laura Baines on October 13, 2006, and the couple has one daughter together named Harper. With The Breadwinner, Nate finally stepped into a leading film role after years of steady, hard-won success on stage, drawing on the same grounded, family-centered sensibility that made his comedy career so successful in the first place. Mandy Moore, who plays Katie Wilcox opposite Nate Bargatze, has built one of the more unusual and enduring careers in modern entertainment, one that began in the pop music world of the late 1990s before evolving into a respected and versatile acting career spanning film, animation, and television. She first broke through as a teenage pop singer, releasing her debut single in 1999 and quickly becoming grouped in the public eye alongside other young female pop stars of that era, even though her own musical taste and ambitions were often more introspective and singer-songwriter oriented than her early bubblegum image suggested. As her music career progressed, she gradually moved toward more personal, acoustic-influenced songwriting, releasing albums that reflected a more mature and authentic artistic voice than her initial mainstream pop packaging. Alongside her music, Mandy transitioned into acting during the early 2000s, appearing in a string of teen-focused films that helped introduce her to a new generation of fans who knew her more for her screen presence than her chart performance. She earned significant attention for her role in A Walk to Remember, a romantic drama that showcased her ability to carry genuine emotional weight on screen, and she continued building a diverse filmography that mixed comedy, drama, and voice work over the following years, including a beloved voice performance as Rapunzel in Disney's animated film Tangled, a role that introduced her to an entirely new audience of younger viewers and became one of the most recognizable parts of her career. Beyond film, Mandy found major television success starring in the acclaimed family drama series This Is Us, playing a character across multiple decades of the character's life through the show's extensive use of time-jumping storytelling, a demanding role that required significant physical transformation through makeup and prosthetics to portray the character at different ages. Her performance in that series earned her widespread critical praise and multiple award nominations, helping to firmly establish her as a serious dramatic actress rather than simply a former pop star turned actress. On a personal level, Mandy has spoken openly at various points in her career about difficult professional experiences early in the music industry, and she has used her platform to advocate for artists' rights and fair treatment within the entertainment business. She is married to musician Taylor Goldsmith, known for his work with the band Dawes, and the couple has built a family together while both continuing active careers in entertainment. With The Breadwinner, Mandy brings the same warmth and emotional grounding that defined her work on This Is Us to the role of Katie, a character whose quiet competence and sudden entrepreneurial success anchor much of the film's emotional core. Colin Jost, part of the film's supporting cast, is widely known first and foremost for his long-running work on Saturday Night Live, where he has spent years both writing for the show and appearing as one of the anchors of its Weekend Update news satire segment. Long before he became a familiar face in front of the camera, Jost worked his way up through the writing ranks of the show, eventually becoming head writer, a role that gave him significant influence over the overall comedic direction and tone of individual episodes during his tenure. His steady, understated delivery style on Weekend Update, often built around dry, ironic commentary on current events, became one of the defining comedic voices of the segment over his many years hosting it. Beyond Saturday Night Live, Jost has written and starred in his own film projects, blending his sharp comedic writing background with an increasing interest in leading and supporting film roles that let him explore character work outside the fast-paced, topical world of live sketch comedy. He has also worked as a stand-up comedian, and has published written work reflecting on his experiences growing up and building a career in comedy. On a personal level, Jost is married to actress Scarlett Johansson, and the couple has built a life together while both maintaining highly visible careers in entertainment, something that has occasionally brought additional public attention to Jost's own work beyond his already well-established profile from television. His involvement in The Breadwinner reflects his continued interest in expanding beyond sketch comedy and topical satire into more character-driven, ensemble-based film comedy, playing a supporting role within Nate Wilcox's chaotic new world as a stay-at-home father. Kumail Nanjiani, another key supporting cast member, has built a career defined by a distinctive blend of stand-up comedy, personal storytelling, and an increasingly wide-ranging set of acting roles that have taken him from small-scale independent comedy into major studio blockbusters. Born and raised in Karachi, Pakistan, before moving to the United States for college, Nanjiani's early stand-up material often drew directly on his experience navigating two very different cultural worlds, a perspective that gave his comedy a distinctive voice from the beginning of his career. He first reached a wide audience through his work on the television series Silicon Valley, playing a socially awkward but sharply intelligent software engineer in a satire of the tech industry, a role that ran for multiple seasons and helped establish him as a reliable comedic performer capable of carrying substantial screen time within an ensemble cast. His career took a significant turn toward more personal, emotionally driven storytelling with the film The Big Sick, a romantic comedy drama that he co-wrote based loosely on his own real-life relationship and the serious health crisis that tested it early on, a project that earned widespread critical acclaim and an Academy Award nomination for its screenplay. That success opened the door to a broader range of roles, including a notably physical transformation for a major role in a Marvel superhero film, where Nanjiani underwent a well-documented and widely discussed fitness transformation to portray a superpowered character, a process he spoke about candidly in interviews as a genuinely difficult undertaking that reshaped how the public viewed his range as a performer. Alongside his acting work, Nanjiani has continued performing stand-up and has been open in interviews about his personal life, including his marriage to writer and producer Emily V. Gordon, with whom he co-wrote The Big Sick, and their ongoing creative partnership across multiple projects. His role in The Breadwinner continues his pattern of moving fluidly between grounded, relatable comedy and larger studio projects, bringing his particular brand of dry, self-aware humor to Nate's circle of friends and neighbors. Will Forte, who also appears in a supporting role, built the foundation of his career during a long tenure as a cast member on Saturday Night Live, where he became known for a series of memorably strange, high-energy characters that showcased his willingness to commit fully to absurd, off-kilter comedy. His time on the show helped establish a reputation for fearless, sometimes deliberately uncomfortable comedic choices, a style that carried over strongly into his film and television work after leaving the series. He gained further recognition through his work on television comedy series that blended surreal humor with more grounded emotional storytelling, and he found significant critical acclaim for his leading role in a black and white independent drama that took a dramatically different tone from most of his earlier comedic work, revealing a more restrained, emotionally layered side of his acting ability that surprised many longtime fans of his broader comedic style. That performance earned him major awards recognition and repositioned him in the eyes of critics as a genuinely versatile actor capable of handling serious dramatic material as well as broad comedy. In the years since, Forte has continued to move between major studio comedies, independent film projects, and television work, often gravitating toward characters who are a little off-center, socially awkward, or quietly strange in ways that make them memorable even in smaller supporting roles. His involvement in The Breadwinner fits naturally within that pattern, bringing his particular gift for grounded, slightly eccentric comedic energy to the world of Nate's neighborhood friendships as the film's chaos builds toward its climax. Zach Cherry, who plays one of the film's supporting characters, was born on November 1, 1987, in Trenton, New Jersey, and developed an early interest in performance that eventually led him to Princeton Day School before he went on to study at Amherst College, graduating in 2010. Long before his screen career took off, Cherry spent years building his comedic instincts on the New York improv scene, performing extensively with the Upright Citizens Brigade, a training ground that has produced a large number of well-known comedic performers over the years. His early screen credits included a brief but widely seen appearance as a street vendor in a major Marvel superhero blockbuster, a small role that nonetheless introduced him to an enormous audience, and that he would later reprise in different forms across other Marvel projects, including an animated series. Over the following years, Cherry built a steady career playing supporting and recurring roles across a wide range of television comedies and dramas, gradually expanding his range from purely comedic parts into more nuanced dramatic television work. His most significant breakthrough came with his role as Dylan George in the acclaimed psychological workplace drama Severance, a part that required him to balance sharp comedic timing with genuine emotional complexity, playing a character caught between two very different versions of his own identity within the show's unusual premise. The role earned him substantial critical praise and significantly raised his public profile, leading to further high-visibility work, including a role in the post-apocalyptic television series Fallout. Known for keeping his personal life relatively private, Cherry has spoken in interviews about maintaining a grounded, low-key lifestyle even as his career has grown, living in Brooklyn and continuing to stay connected to the improv comedy community that shaped his early development as a performer. His work in The Breadwinner continues his pattern of blending comedic timing with a more layered, character-driven approach, adding another grounded supporting presence to the film's ensemble cast. Martin Herlihy, another member of the supporting cast, was born on September 13, 1998, and grew up with an especially close connection to the world of comedy writing, being the son of Tim Herlihy, a longtime screenwriter well known for his extensive collaborations with Adam Sandler throughout the 1990s and beyond. Growing up around that world gave Martin an early exposure to comedy writing and film production that clearly influenced his own career path. He attended New York University, where he studied at the Tisch School of the Arts and became involved with the campus sketch comedy group Hammercats, a well-known training ground for young comedic writers and performers in New York. It was during this period that he began collaborating closely with fellow students Ben Marshall and John Higgins, and together the three of them formed the sketch comedy trio Please Don't Destroy in 2017, building an audience initially through live shows, comedy festival appearances, and short-form sketch videos posted online. Their sharp, absurdist sensibility and growing online following eventually caught the attention of Saturday Night Live, and in 2021 the trio was hired to join the show's writing staff for its 47th season, quickly becoming known for producing some of the show's most widely shared pre-taped digital sketches. Martin continued to write for the show across multiple seasons while also appearing in a number of the group's pre-taped segments, and the trio's growing popularity led to a national comedy tour and eventually their first feature film, a comedy adventure that Martin co-wrote alongside his two collaborators and in which all three also starred, produced with the backing of a major Hollywood studio. In more recent developments to his career, changes within the Saturday Night Live cast and writing structure saw one of his collaborators depart the show while another moved into a full cast member role, with Martin himself remaining on staff as a writer while continuing to branch out into other on-screen acting opportunities, including a role in a major studio action film, and now his supporting part in The Breadwinner. His involvement in the film reflects the same qualities that made Please Don't Destroy's work so distinctive online: a willingness to commit fully to odd, escalating comedic scenarios, which fits naturally within the increasingly chaotic world Nate Wilcox finds himself living in throughout the film. Brett Cullen, who plays Nate's father in the film, has spent more than 4 decades building one of the more prolific and durable careers among American character actors, moving fluidly between film, television, and stage work since the late 1970s. Born Peter Brett Cullen on August 26, 1956, in Houston, Texas, he developed an early interest in performing and went on to study theater at the University of Houston, graduating in 1979 after spending 4 seasons performing with the well-regarded Houston Shakespeare Festival. During his college years, he formed a lasting friendship with fellow student and future major film star Dennis Quaid, a bond that has continued throughout both of their careers. After graduating, Cullen moved to Los Angeles to pursue acting professionally, landing his first major role in the 1980 television miniseries The Chisholms, followed by small early appearances in shows including The Incredible Hulk and MASH. His film debut came in the 1986 comedy Stewardess School, in which he took on a leading role, though for a stretch of his career afterward he found more consistent success in television rather than film, building a long-running presence across numerous primetime dramas throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. Notable television credits over the years included substantial runs on the soap opera Falcon Crest, appearances on prestige dramas such as The West Wing and Lost, and later a recurring role on the acclaimed high school football drama Friday Night Lights. On the film side, Cullen has appeared in a wide range of notable projects over the decades, including a supporting role in the celebrated space drama Apollo 13, parts in films such as Ghost Rider and The Guilt Trip, and a memorable appearance as a congressman in The Dark Knight Rises. In more recent years, he gained significant additional attention for his role as Thomas Wayne in the acclaimed 2019 film Joker, a part that introduced him to an entirely new generation of moviegoers and placed him within one of the most talked about films of that year. Away from acting, Cullen has spoken about his interests in golf and surfing, and he co-owns a production company together with musician Meat Loaf, having also contributed backing vocals to one of Meat Loaf's well-known album tracks earlier in his career. He is married to actress Michelle Little, and the two have one daughter together. His role in The Breadwinner, playing Nate's easygoing and quietly disruptive father, draws on decades of experience playing warm, grounded, often understated supporting characters, adding a veteran presence to the film's ensemble cast of comedic performers. The Breadwinner budget, making, and funny behind-the-scenes moments. The Breadwinner arrived in theaters as a mid-budget studio comedy, the kind of modestly scaled, star-driven project that Hollywood has largely stopped making in recent years in favor of massive franchise tentpoles. The film carried a production budget of roughly $25 million, financed and distributed by Sony Pictures under its TriStar Pictures banner, with additional production involvement from Nate Bargatz's own company, Nate Land, alongside One Man Canoe Productions. For a film in this genre, $25 million sits right in that increasingly rare middle ground, too expensive to be treated as a cheap streaming afterthought, yet nowhere near the scale of the effects-driven blockbusters that now dominate the summer release calendar. That budget had to cover everything from principal photography and a recognizable ensemble cast to visual effects work for its more chaotic sequences, an original musical score, and the kind of polished studio comedy production values audiences expect from a wide theatrical release. Industry analysts who track box office economics pointed out that a film with this budget typically needs to gross somewhere between $50 and $60 million worldwide just to break even once marketing and distribution costs are factored in on top of the production budget itself, a number that framed The Breadwinner as something of a genuine financial gamble for the studio, betting heavily on Nate Bargatz's massive, largely untapped stand-up fan base translating into ticket sales for his very first leading film role. Principal photography began in the spring of 2025, with filming taking place primarily in the state of Georgia rather than in Nashville, Tennessee, the city where the story itself is culturally rooted and where Nate Wilcox's fictional car dealership is meant to be located. Much of the production was based out of Trillis Studios in Fayetteville, Georgia, a large-scale studio facility previously known as Pinewood Atlanta Studios that has become one of the most heavily used production hubs in the American film industry over the past decade. Filming combined soundstage work at Trilith with location shooting in real suburban neighborhoods around the greater Atlanta area, giving the production team the ability to build a believable, everyday American household setting without the logistical costs of shooting on location in Nashville itself. The choice to shoot in Georgia rather than Tennessee reflects a common and pragmatic reality of modern film production, where tax incentives and studio infrastructure often determine where a story actually gets filmed, even when the narrative itself carries strong regional identity tied to a completely different city. Despite the Georgia-based shoot, the production worked hard to keep the flavor of Nashville alive throughout the film, weaving in references to local culture, including nods to the Tennessee Titans, that helped ground the story in its intended setting even though the cameras were rolling several states away. Filming continued through the summer and into the later part of the year without any major reported delays, wrapping principal photography around the middle of December of that year, after which the production moved fully into post-production, where editor Evan Hincke began assembling the footage while composers Leo Berenberg and Zach Robinson, who had previously worked with director Eric Appel on his earlier film Weird the Al Yankovic Story, came aboard to build the film's warm, playful musical score. Director Eric Appel brought a very specific comedic sensibility to the project, having built his reputation on blending mockumentary-style humor with genuine emotional sincerity in his earlier work. Before The Breadwinner, Appel had directed Weird the Al Yankovic Story, a wildly exaggerated, self-aware biographical comedy that developed a passionate cult following despite never receiving a traditional theatrical release, along with the Die Hard films, an action comedy franchise built around Kevin Hart playing an exaggerated version of himself. That background made Appel a logical choice to guide a first-time film lead like Nate Bargatze through the transition from stand-up performer to screen actor, someone who understood how to translate a distinct, established comedic voice onto film without flattening what made that voice special in the first place. Still, the working relationship between Appel and Bargatze produced one of the most genuinely funny recurring stories to come out of the entire production. According to behind-the-scenes footage released during filming, Bargatze struggled for weeks to shake off one of the most fundamental habits of his stand-up career, the simple physical need to hold something in his hand while performing. Appel joked publicly that Bargatze had insisted before filming began that he would not need any help adjusting from stand-up to acting, only for the production to discover almost immediately that Bargatze physically could not get through a scene without instinctively reaching for something to hold as though it were a microphone. Behind-the-scenes clips showed him repeatedly grabbing whatever prop happened to be within arm's reach on set, and holding it exactly the way he would hold a microphone on stage, including at various points a banana and a television remote control, treating ordinary household props as stand-ins for the piece of stage equipment he had spent over 2 decades performing with. Appel described the habit almost sympathetically, comparing it to the disorientation other stand-up comedians have reportedly experienced when transitioning to scripted film work, joking that performers in that position feel physically incomplete without that familiar weight in their hand, reaching for literally anything nearby just to fill the void. Even 2 months into the shooting schedule, the habit reportedly had not fully disappeared, turning into a light-hearted running joke among the cast and crew and giving Bargatze himself plenty of material to laugh about once filming wrapped. Beyond the mic habit, Bargatze has spoken candidly in interviews about where the emotional core of the film's premise actually came from, tracing it directly back to a real and slightly embarrassing moment from his own life as a father. He explained that a great deal of his stand-up material over the years has drawn on stories about his own household mishaps, and one specific anecdote in particular became the seed that eventually grew into the entire concept for The Breadwinner. He recalled receiving a phone call while his daughter was still in elementary school asking which school bus she was supposed to be riding home on, a question he had absolutely no idea how to answer, having never actually learned the details of her daily school routine because his wife had always handled that responsibility without him ever needing to think about it. That single moment of parental panic and cluelessness, born from years of unintentionally outsourcing the daily logistics of parenting to his wife, became a recurring bit in his live shows long before it evolved into the foundation of a feature film screenplay, giving the entire project a layer of lived in authenticity underneath its broader, more exaggerated comedic set pieces. Mandy Moore, who stars opposite Bargatze as Katie Wilcox, has offered her own vivid behind-the-scenes account of filming one of the movie's most pivotal sequences, the recreation of Katie's original Shark Tank pitch that sets the entire plot into motion. Rather than simply staging a loose approximation of a reality television pitch, the production arranged to film the sequence under conditions that closely mirrored how an actual episode of the long-running business competition show gets shot, complete with real-time pressure built directly into the shooting schedule. Moore described being scheduled at the very end of a long shooting day, Given only about 90 minutes to actually shoot the pitch scene under a hard time limit, filming it essentially the same way a real entrepreneur would experience walking into the tank for the first time. She has spoken about how genuinely nervous she felt heading into that sequence, admitting that she needed encouragement from the stage manager just to calm her nerves before cameras rolled, since she wanted the fear and adrenaline driving her performance to feel completely real rather than performed, playing a woman who had never appeared on camera professionally before and was suddenly facing an enormous, life-altering decision in front of a panel of intimidating investors. That combination of a tight, unforgiving shooting window and a scene built entirely around escalating tension gave Moore's performance in that moment a jittery, high-stakes authenticity that several critics later singled out as one of the more effective dramatic beats buried inside an otherwise broad comedic film. Of all the sequences that came together during production, none generated more attention, both during filming and after the film's release, than the elaborate set piece involving Keegan's horse making its way into the Wilcox family home. From the earliest teaser footage released by Sony, the image of a horse wandering through and eventually rampaging inside an ordinary suburban living room became the single most talked about visual from the entire marketing campaign, appearing prominently in nearly every trailer and clip the studio put out ahead of release. Executing that sequence required careful coordination between animal handlers, camera operators, and the film's stunt and effects teams, since working with a live horse inside a constructed household set presents an entirely different set of technical challenges than a typical comedic set piece involving only human actors. Getting a large animal to convincingly appear startled, to move through tight interior spaces without genuinely damaging the set beyond what the production intended, and to do so safely across multiple takes required an enormous amount of behind-the-scenes planning that audiences would never see reflected on screen, all in service of a sequence that ultimately runs only a few minutes in the finished film. Bargatze himself has joked in interviews and in his own stand-up material about the strange logistical comedy inherent in even discussing what to do with a large farm animal that appears to have died inside a family home, material that predates the film itself, and that clearly informed how enthusiastically he leaned into the sequence once it came time to actually shoot it. Whatever critics ultimately thought of the scene's comedic execution once the film reached theaters, there is little doubt that it represented one of the more logistically ambitious and genuinely challenging sequences the production tackled, and cast members have described the atmosphere on set during those shooting days as unusually chaotic even by the standards of an already fairly loose, improvisation-friendly comedy production. The supporting cast brought its own distinct energy to the shoot, with Colin Jost, Kumail Nanjiani, Will Forte, Zach Cherry, and Martin Herlihy all playing various friends, neighbors, and colleagues who orbit around Nate's chaotic new home life. Given that several of these performers, including Jost, Forte, and Herlihy, share a background rooted in Saturday Night Live's fast-paced, heavily improvised sketch environment, the production reportedly leaned into that shared comedic instinct by giving performers a fair amount of room to riff and adjust dialogue within scenes rather than sticking rigidly to the script at every turn. A common practice on modern studio comedies that helps generate additional usable material during editing. Having performers with that particular blend of backgrounds together on set for extended stretches naturally created a loose, high-energy atmosphere between takes, with several of the film's smaller supporting comedic beats reportedly growing out of small improvised additions during rehearsal or between formal takes rather than existing in the original shooting script. One especially memorable detail that emerged from the production involves the film's use of cameo appearances, with all three of Bargatze's real-life Nateland podcast co-hosts, Brian Bates, Aaron Weber, and Dusty Slay, appearing briefly in the finished film. For longtime listeners of Bargatze's podcast, spotting those three familiar voices popping up in small roles throughout the movie added an extra layer of inside joke recognition that only deepened the sense that this project, despite being a major studio release, still carried the fingerprints of Bargatze's much smaller, more personal comedy world. The production also became something of a talking point among critics after release for its unusually heavy use of visible brand integration throughout the finished film, with multiple reviewers specifically calling out prominent, repeated appearances of real-world companies including Toyota, Walmart, and various named cereal brands woven directly into scenes and even into dialogue. Several critics speculated openly that this level of brand integration likely played a meaningful role in helping offset the film's $25 million production budget, a common but rarely so visibly acknowledged practice in modern studio filmmaking, where paid product placement deals can quietly subsidize a significant portion of a mid-budget project's overall costs. Whether or not that speculation about the specific financial arrangements was accurate, the sheer visibility of those brand appearances became one of the more frequently repeated criticisms in reviews once the film reached theaters, standing in contrast to the more old-fashioned, nostalgic family comedy tone the marketing campaign had otherwise leaned into. Sony's release strategy for the film shifted meaningfully over the months leading up to its theatrical debut. The Breadwinner was originally announced with a planned release date of March 13, 2026, positioning it as an early spring counter-programming option. As post-production continued, however, Sony made the decision to move the release significantly later on the calendar, ultimately landing on May 29, 2026, placing the film squarely at the start of the crowded summer blockbuster corridor and specifically targeting the Memorial Day weekend period as an entry point into the broader family-focused summer moviegoing season. Industry observers noted at the time that this repositioning reflected a calculated bet on the part of the studio, essentially treating Bargatz's massive, largely untapped arena touring fan base as a potential secret weapon capable of driving family audiences into theaters during a stretch of the calendar traditionally dominated by big-budget franchise films rather than modestly budgeted original comedies. When the film finally opened, it debuted across roughly 3,200 theaters domestically, earning a bit over $7 million in its opening weekend, a result that landed it in fifth place at the domestic box office that weekend and put its average per-theater earnings solidly in line with, though not dramatically exceeding, the historical opening performance of other recent theatrical vehicles built around individual stand-up comedians. Over the course of its full domestic theatrical run, which concluded in early July, the film ultimately grossed a bit over $20 million domestically, a result that fell noticeably short of the $50 to $60 million worldwide benchmark analysts had identified as the film's approximate break-even point, making The Breadwinner a financial underperformer for the studio relative to its production budget and marketing spend, even though it was far from a total box office disaster. Nate Bargatze marked the film's release with an especially personal touch, choosing to hold one of his premiere celebrations in his own hometown of Nashville rather than treating the film purely as a Los Angeles industry event. The hometown screening took place at the Regal Hollywood Theater location off Thompson Lane, a venue Bargatze has spoken about warmly as the very theater where he grew up watching movies as a kid long before he ever imagined starring in one of his own. Walking the blue carpet in the city where he was raised, surrounded by family, friends, and longtime supporters rather than an exclusively industry crowd, Bargatze described the entire experience as something that had worked out about as perfectly as he could have hoped, a full-circle moment that connected his earliest memories of moviegoing directly to his first experience as a leading man in his own studio film. Looking at the production as a whole, The Breadwinner represents an increasingly rare kind of Hollywood bet, a mid-budget, star-driven comedy built almost entirely around the specific, established comedic persona of a single performer making his leading film debut, surrounded by a supporting cast pulled heavily from the modern sketch comedy and improv world. The behind-the-scenes stories that emerged from the production, from Bargatze's inability to let go of his imaginary stand-up microphone, to Mandy Moore's genuinely nerve-wracking recreation of a real Shark Tank pitch under a hard 90-minute clock, to the logistically complicated chaos of bringing a live horse convincingly through a suburban living room set, all point to a shoot that carried real energy and a fair amount of spontaneous, unscripted comedy even before any of it reached the Editing room. Whether or not that on-set energy ultimately translated into box office success once the film reached general audiences, The Making of the Breadwinner offers a genuinely interesting case study in how a modern comedian built for arena stages and Netflix specials navigates the very different demands of studio filmmaking, working alongside a director experienced in exaggerated, self-aware comedy and a supporting cast fluent in the fast, improvisational rhythms of live sketch television, all in service of trying to revive a type of broad, wholesome family comedy that has become increasingly rare on the big screen. The Breadwinner cultural and historical details. To really understand where The Breadwinner fits into the broader landscape of American film, it helps to look past the specific plot of Nate Wilcox and his three daughters and consider the much longer cinematic tradition the movie is quietly stepping into. Long before Nate Bargatze ever picked up a script, Hollywood had already built an entire subgenre around the idea of a confident, capable father suddenly thrown into full-time parenting and discovering just how difficult it actually is. The most obvious ancestor of this tradition is the 1983 comedy Mr. Mom, in which a laid-off auto executive stays home to raise his children while his wife returns to the workforce, fumbling his way through laundry, grocery shopping, and school routines in ways that became a defining comedic template for decades of family films that followed. That template resurfaced again and again over the years, echoed in films like Daddy Day Care in the early 2000s and later in ensemble-heavy family comedies such as Cheaper by the Dozen, all of which mine the same basic comedic well, a parent who is excellent at their professional life suddenly discovering that the unpaid, invisible labor of running a household is a completely different, and far more demanding kind of work. Multiple critics reviewing The Breadwinner pointed directly to this lineage, explicitly comparing Bargatze's film to Mr. Mom in particular, noting that while the specific cultural details have obviously been updated for a modern audience, complete with a Shark Tank pitch replacing a factory layoff as the inciting incident, the underlying comedic structure and central joke remain almost identical to a formula that is now more than 40 years old. This lineage matters because it places The Breadwinner inside an ongoing, decades-spanning cultural conversation about domestic labor, gender roles, and who is expected to manage the daily logistics of raising children. A conversation that Hollywood keeps returning to precisely because it remains relatable to new generations of parents even as the broader cultural attitudes surrounding gender and work continue to shift underneath it. What makes The Breadwinner's specific moment in that ongoing tradition interesting is the way it consciously updates the formula's gender politics for a contemporary audience while still working within a fairly old-fashioned premise. In the film's own opening voiceover, Nate directly acknowledges that the traditional setup of husband as breadwinner and wife as full-time homemaker might sound a bit old-fashioned by modern standards, a self-aware nod to the fact that the film is essentially reviving a family structure and a comedic formula that many younger audiences might view as somewhat dated. Rather than simply presenting that traditional arrangement uncritically, the film uses its plot to actively challenge and complicate it, having Katie step outside the domestic role entirely to build her own business, while Nate is forced to confront just how much invisible labor and skill actually goes into the work he had always taken for granted. Several reviewers, including those writing from explicitly faith-based and family-oriented publications, praised this structural choice as a meaningful, if not particularly subtle, cultural statement, framing the film as a story that ultimately argues for a more modern, more equal understanding of partnership within marriage even while starting from a fairly traditional premise. That tension between an old-fashioned setup and a more contemporary resolution mirrors a broader cultural negotiation happening across American society more generally, as more and more families move away from strictly defined single-earner household structures toward more flexible, shared arrangements where their partner might step into the primary earner role at different points in their relationship. Something that would have been a much more radical premise for a mainstream studio comedy. Decades earlier, Nate Bargatze's own comedic identity carries significant cultural weight in how audiences approach this film, an understanding that identity requires looking at what has come to be known within the comedy industry as clean comedy, a specific stylistic and cultural lane that stands in deliberate contrast to the more vulgar, boundary-pushing material that has dominated much of stand-up comedy over the past several decades. Clean comedy, historically associated with performers whose material avoids profanity, explicit sexual content, and overtly political or controversial subject matter, has a long lineage stretching back through comedians whose humor relied on precise observation and timing rather than shock value. Bargatze has positioned himself as one of the most commercially successful contemporary practitioners of that style, building an enormous, multi-generational fan base specifically because his material can be enjoyed by an entire family sitting together in the same room without anyone needing to worry about content that might be inappropriate for younger listeners. This approach carries a distinct cultural and, for some audiences, even religious significance, since Bargatze has been open about his Southern Baptist upbringing and his Christian faith continuing to inform his comedic values, avoiding material that conflicts with those beliefs even as his career has grown to an enormous scale. Several publications framed his rise as part of a broader cultural moment in which audiences fatigued by increasingly cynical, shock-driven entertainment have begun actively seeking out performers whose work feels safe, wholesome, and genuinely suitable for shared family viewing, a countercurrent running against much of what dominates modern comedy and streaming content more broadly. The Breadwinner was widely discussed in coverage leading up to its release as a direct extension of that same cultural appeal, explicitly marketed and understood by critics and fans alike as an attempt to translate Bargatze's clean, broadly accessible comedic brand from the stand-up stage onto the big screen, testing whether an audience built around live arena shows and streaming specials would actually show up to a movie theater for more of the same sensibility in a different format. That cultural positioning connected the film to another significant industry storyline that extended well beyond Bargatze himself, namely the broader, much-discussed decline of the mainstream theatrical family comedy as a genre over roughly the past 15 to 20 years. Multiple entertainment publications covering the Breadwinner's release explicitly framed the film as a potential test case for whether Hollywood could successfully revive a type of movie that had largely disappeared from wide theatrical release, the broad, inoffensive, all-ages comedy that entire families could attend together without worrying about mature content, a category that dominated multiplexes throughout the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s but has become increasingly rare. As studios shifted their theatrical strategy heavily toward franchise blockbusters, animated films, and horror, while pushing smaller-scale adult comedies towards streaming platforms instead. Industry commentary around the Breadwinner's release repeatedly asked whether Bargatze's massive existing fan base, built through arena tours and record-breaking Netflix specials, might represent a genuinely new pathway for reviving that dormant genre, essentially using an established comedian's pre-built audience as a foundation for rebuilding theatrical demand for wholesome family content rather than relying purely on original intellectual property or established franchise recognition. This framing situates the Breadwinner within a larger, ongoing conversation in the film industry about how theaters can compete for family audiences against the convenience of streaming, and whether star-driven original comedies still have a viable theatrical future in an entertainment landscape increasingly dominated by pre-existing franchises and adaptations. The film's connection to Shark Tank as a cultural institution also deserves attention, since the reality television business competition show functions as far more than a simple plot device inside the story. Since its debut, Shark Tank has become one of the most culturally significant reality programs in American television, transforming the once niche world of startup pitching and venture investment into mainstream entertainment, turning its panel of wealthy investors into recognizable celebrities in their own right, and turning the pitch itself into a widely understood cultural shorthand for the classic American entrepreneurial success story. By building the entire inciting incident of the Breadwinner around Katie's appearance on the show, the film taps directly into that broader cultural mythology, the idea that an ordinary person with a clever, practical invention born out of real-life necessity can walk into a room, deliver a compelling pitch, and instantly transform their family's entire financial and professional trajectory. That premise reflects a very particular, very contemporary version of the American dream narrative, one built around viral visibility and reality television validation rather than the more traditional, slower-building career advancement narratives found in earlier decades of family comedy. The film's decision to actually recreate the Shark Tank pitch scene under conditions closely mirroring how the real show is produced, complete with a tight shooting schedule designed to replicate the real emotional pressure contestants experience, further reinforces how seriously the production treated this cultural touchstone, using it not just as a punchline but as a genuine emotional and narrative anchor for the entire story that follows. Nate Bargatz's broader career trajectory also carries historical weight worth examining, situating the Breadwinner within a long-running and frequently discussed pattern in American entertainment, the pipeline through which successful stand-up comedians eventually attempt to translate their stage personas into leading film roles. This pattern stretches back decades, with generations of comedians using stand-up success as a launching pad into film stardom with wildly varying degrees of success, and industry analysts covering the Breadwinner's box office performance explicitly place the film within that historical context. Comparing its opening weekend numbers against other recent theatrical vehicles built around individual touring comedians. Those comparisons highlighted a recurring structural challenge within this pipeline, the fact that a comedian's ability to sell out arenas and streaming specials does not always translate cleanly into ticket sales for a scripted film, since stand-up audiences and traditional movie-going audiences do not always overlap as neatly as studios might hope. The Breadwinner's opening weekend performance was explicitly measured against several other recent comedian-led theatrical films built around similarly popular touring performers, situating Bargatz's film debut within an active, ongoing industry experiment testing exactly how much box office power a massive live comedy following can actually generate once that same audience is asked to buy a movie ticket rather than a concert ticket. This broader context helps explain why so much of the pre-release coverage around the Breadwinner focused as heavily on Bargatz's extraordinary live touring success, including his record-breaking arena performances and his status as one of the highest-grossing stand-up comedians working today, as it did on the film's actual plot or comedic content. Since the entire release was widely understood within the industry as a referendum on whether that specific brand of live comedy stardom could successfully carry a theatrical film. The gap between critical reception and audience reception that emerged once the Breadwinner reached theaters also became its own significant cultural talking point, reflecting a broader pattern that has become increasingly common and increasingly discussed across contemporary film criticism more generally. Professional critics were largely unimpressed with the film, with reviews from major outlets describing it using words like stale, lazy, and thoroughly bland, with some critics specifically taking issue with the very clean comedic sensibility that forms the core of Bargatz's appeal, arguing that stripping out edgier material left the film without enough genuine comedic tension or bite to sustain a full-length feature. At the same time, multiple entertainment publications specifically noted a pronounced divide between how critics and general audiences responded to the film, with regular moviegoers reporting considerably more enjoyment and warmth toward the movie than the largely negative critical consensus would suggest. This particular critic versus audience divide has become an increasingly common storyline across contemporary entertainment coverage, often centered specifically around family-friendly, faith-adjacent, or broadly accessible content that professional critics, whose tastes frequently skew toward edgier or more formally ambitious work, tend to respond to less favorably than the broader mainstream audiences such films are actually designed to serve. Commentary specifically framed The Breadwinner as yet another example of this widening gap, situating the film within an ongoing cultural debate about who professional film criticism is actually written for, and whether that critical framework adequately captures or represents the experience of the large, family-oriented audience segment that films like this one are specifically built to reach. The film's behind-the-scenes production partnerships add another layer of cultural context worth understanding. Alongside TriStar Pictures and Bargatz's own Nateland production company, the film's development also involved Wonder Project, a production company explicitly associated with faith-based and socially conservative family entertainment. Wonder Project's prior theatrical success with a faith-adjacent family film helped position the company as a credible co-production partner for The Breadwinner, reflecting a broader industry pattern in which openly faith-oriented production companies have increasingly partnered with major studios to help identify and market projects specifically toward the large, historically underserved audience of faith-based and socially conservative moviegoers, a demographic that industry analysts have increasingly recognized as commercially significant, particularly for family-oriented and wholesome content that might otherwise struggle to find a clear marketing identity within a crowded theatrical release calendar. This partnership reflects a growing and historically significant shift within the film industry more broadly, as studios have become increasingly willing to explicitly court faith-based audiences as a distinct, reliably engaged commercial demographic, treating explicitly wholesome, family-centered, values-driven storytelling not as a creative limitation but as a genuine marketing asset capable of driving ticket sales among audiences who feel increasingly alienated by more explicit, or morally ambiguous mainstream entertainment. Regional identity plays its own quiet but meaningful cultural role throughout the film as well. Although the movie was shot almost entirely in Georgia for practical production reasons, the story itself is deeply rooted in Nashville, Tennessee, both through its setting and through Nate Bargatz's own real-life identity as a proud, deeply connected Nashville native. Bargatz has spoken repeatedly about his hometown pride, going so far as to hold one of the film's premiere celebrations at the very Nashville movie theater where he grew up watching films as a child, and his ongoing plans to build a large-scale entertainment destination in the city further reflect how central that regional identity remains to his broader public persona. The film itself works to preserve some of that Southern, Tennessee-flavored cultural texture even while being physically filmed hundreds of miles away, weaving in references to distinctly local touchstones like the Tennessee Titans football team and framing Nate's fictional career as a car salesman within a recognizably Southern, working-class professional culture. This regional grounding matters culturally because it continues a long-standing tradition within American comedy of using specific, authentic regional identity as a foundation for broader universal humor, allowing audiences from a particular part of the country to see their own culture reflected on screen while still crafting a story general enough to resonate with audiences well outside the American South. Finally, it is worth situating The Breadwinner within the specific historical moment of its theatrical release, a period marked by significant ongoing uncertainty about the future of mid-budget original comedy within the broader theatrical marketplace. The film's underwhelming opening weekend, in which it was notably overshadowed at the box office by low-budget horror films made by younger, internet-native filmmakers, was widely interpreted by industry commentators as reflecting a larger structural challenge facing exactly the kind of film The Breadwinner represents, an original, non-franchise, star-driven comedy attempting to draw a broad family audience into theaters during an era when that audience has increasingly comfortable, convenient streaming alternatives available at home. Commentary following the film's release repeatedly framed its box office performance as a meaningful, if somewhat disappointing, data point in the ongoing industry-wide question of whether individual comedians' star power alone can still reliably fill movie theaters the way it sometimes could in earlier decades, or whether that particular model of theatrical moviegoing has become permanently diminished regardless of how large a given comedian's existing fan base might be. Regardless of where that larger industry question ultimately lands, The Breadwinner's release itself became a genuinely significant data point within that unfolding conversation, a closely watched experiment in whether one of the most successful live comedians in the country could translate his enormous, loyal following into a meaningful theatrical box office result. And an object lesson in just how complicated that translation has become in the modern entertainment landscape. Taken together, all of these layers, the film's roots in a decades-old genre tradition, its careful navigation of shifting cultural attitudes toward gender roles and domestic labor, its deep connection to Bargatz's clean comedy brand and Christian identity, its ties to the cultural mythology of Shark Tank and modern entrepreneurship, its place within the long-running comedian-to-film star pipeline, its faith-based production partnerships, its regional Nashville identity, and its release into an uncertain theatrical marketplace make The Breadwinner a far more culturally layered project than its relatively simple, familiar surface premise might initially suggest. It is a film that sits at the intersection of several significant, ongoing conversations happening simultaneously across the entertainment industry and American culture more broadly, conversations about who gets to lead family-friendly content, how gender roles within the household are being renegotiated on screen and off, whether wholesome entertainment can still find a mainstream commercial audience, and whether the traditional model of a beloved performer carrying a movie purely through the strength of their existing fan base still holds up in a rapidly changing theatrical landscape. Whatever one ultimately thinks of the film's comedic execution, its cultural positioning alone makes it a genuinely interesting artifact of this particular moment in American entertainment history. If you found this deep dive into the cultural and historical context behind The Breadwinner interesting, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves understanding the bigger picture behind their favorite movies, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another detailed breakdown of new Hollywood films. The Breadwinner ironic historical details. There is a particular kind of irony that runs quietly underneath almost every layer of The Breadwinner, from its title and its casting to its release strategy and its eventual box office fate, and once you start looking for it, it becomes difficult to stop noticing just how many of the film's real-world details seem to loop back on themselves in unexpectedly poetic ways. The most obvious place to begin is with the title itself. A breadwinner, in the traditional sense of the word, refers to the person in a household who earns the income that keeps the family financially afloat, and for the entire first act of the film, that role clearly belongs to Nate, the confident car salesman climbing his dealership's sales board every month while his wife manages the home. Yet, by the time the story reaches its conclusion, the entire meaning of that title has effectively flipped. Katie becomes the one generating serious income through the Starminder, while Nate steps away from his sales job entirely to help build her business alongside her, meaning the very word used to title the film ends up describing almost the opposite character by the final scene than it would have described at the beginning. A title that seems, on its surface, to be about Nate turns out, by the end, to actually be about Katie, a small but genuinely elegant irony baked directly into the film's marketing from day one, whether audiences noticed it walking in or not. That same irony extends into the film's use of dramatic structure, particularly in how it handles its most famous and most heavily marketed sequence, the horse rampaging through the Wilcox living room. The entire comedic engine of that scene runs on a classic device that storytellers have used for centuries: dramatic irony, the gap between what the audience understands and what the characters themselves believe to be true. Nate and Keegan are both convinced, with total sincerity, that the horse lying motionless in the yard has died overnight, and they proceed accordingly, treating the moment with the somber seriousness of an actual animal death, carefully trying to move the body before the children can see it and become upset. The audience, however, generally understands well before the characters do that horses frequently sleep standing up or lying down without actually being dead, meaning viewers are essentially watching two grown men solemnly attempt to relocate a corpse that is, in fact, simply having a very deep nap. That gap between character understanding and audience understanding is one of the oldest comedic tools in existence, and it is more than a little fitting that a film so heavily built around old-fashioned genre formulas would lean on one of the oldest structural tricks in the entire history of comedic storytelling for its single most talked-about sequence. Another rich vein of irony runs through the film's handling of authenticity, a theme the story itself directly engages with during its climactic live stream sequence, and one that ended up mirroring much of the real-world criticism the finished film received once it reached theaters. Inside the story, Nate and his makeshift team of friends and family spend a frantic, chaotic stretch of time constructing an elaborate illusion, dressing up Connor's house to look convincingly like the real Wilcox home for Katie's investor livestream, presenting a polished, put-together version of domestic life that does not actually reflect the genuine chaos happening behind the scenes. The entire sequence builds toward the idea that constructed, staged authenticity eventually collapses under its own weight, and that real vulnerability, delivered honestly rather than performed for an audience, ends up being far more compelling than any carefully arranged illusion. It is more than a little ironic, then, that once the actual finished film reached professional critics, several of the harshest reviews accused The Breadwinner of committing exactly the same sin its own plot warns against, describing the film as overly polished, artificially safe, and lacking the genuine messiness and bite that might have made it feel more honest and alive. A movie that spends its third act arguing that staged perfection rings hollow compared to real, unscripted honesty ended up being criticized by some reviewers for feeling a little too staged and polished itself, a strange bit of thematic self-reflection that the filmmakers likely never intended but that critics could not resist pointing out once the movie actually opened. The film's relationship with its own clean comedy identity produces perhaps the richest irony of the entire production. Nate Bargatze built his enormous, historically successful stand-up career specifically by avoiding the crude, boundary-pushing material that defines much of modern comedy, positioning cleanliness and broad accessibility not as a limitation but as his single greatest professional asset, the exact quality that allowed him to sell out arenas full of multiple generations of the same family sitting together. When The Breadwinner finally reached theaters, however, that very same defining strength became the central weapon several critics used against it, with more than one reviewer explicitly arguing that Bargatze's commitment to clean, inoffensive material stripped the film of the comedic tension and bite necessary to sustain a full-length feature, essentially suggesting that the same quality responsible for his massive commercial success on stage became a genuine liability once translated to the different demands of narrative filmmaking. It is a strikingly ironic reversal, watching the exact trait that built an entire career, cleanliness as a selling point rather than a constraint, get reframed by critics as the movie's fundamental creative weakness, almost as though the qualities that make someone a beloved arena-filling stand-up comedian and the qualities that make a satisfying 90-minute film comedy are not always the same qualities after all. There is a related irony buried in the specific audience divide that emerged once reviews started rolling in. Multiple entertainment outlets specifically noted a wide gap between how professional critics responded to the film and how everyday audiences responded to it, with critics largely unimpressed while regular moviegoers reported considerably more warmth and enjoyment. This split is itself a little ironic given the film's entire thematic argument, since The Breadwinner is fundamentally a story about learning to value work that goes unrecognized and unrewarded by traditional metrics of success, the invisible, uncelebrated labor of running a household day after day without applause or professional credit. In a strange, almost accidental way, the film's own critical reception echoed its central theme, with the quieter, less prestige-driven appreciation of ordinary audiences going largely unrecognized by the more visible, more officially credentialed voices of professional criticism. Not entirely unlike how Katie's years of quiet household competence went unnoticed and unrewarded by the outside world until a reality television deal finally gave it a public spotlight. The film's own behind-the-scenes production details carry their own quiet ironies as well, none more charming than the now well-documented story of Nate Bargatze's inability to stop reaching for something to hold in his hand while performing, a lingering habit left over from more than 2 decades of holding a microphone on stand-up stages. Director Eric Appel has spoken about catching Bargatze repeatedly grabbing random nearby objects, including at various points a banana and a television remote, treating them instinctively as stand-ins for a stage microphone even in scenes that had nothing to do with performing or public speaking. There is something genuinely fitting about this real behind-the-scenes anecdote, given that Nate's character in the film is a man who spends the entire story learning to let go of his old professional identity as a car salesman in order to fully embrace a completely different role at home. The real Nate Bargatze, meanwhile, was quite literally unable to let go of the physical habits of his own old career even while playing a character whose entire arc is built around letting go of his, a small, unplanned but genuinely poetic overlap between the actor's real-life muscle memory and the character's fictional emotional journey, playing out side by side on the very same set. Mandy Moore's own career history adds another layer of quiet, unintentional irony to her casting as Katie. Long before she ever stepped into the role of a woman finally getting the chance to build something entirely her own after years of being defined by her role within a household, Moore's own real career began under the very different, often more restrictive conditions of the late 90s pop music industry, an environment she has spoken about candidly in interviews as one where young performers, especially young women, often had limited creative control and were shaped heavily by the expectations of others rather than their own artistic instincts. Over the following decades, Moore gradually built a more independent, more personally directed career, moving from a tightly packaged pop image into more mature music and eventually into acclaimed dramatic television work that showcased far more of her own range and creative voice. Watching her play a character whose entire arc in The Breadwinner is about finally stepping outside a role defined by other people's expectations to build something entirely her own carries a quiet, likely unintentional but nonetheless striking personal resonance. An actress whose own real professional history involved a similar journey from externally defined expectations toward genuine creative independence. Now playing a character experiencing a smaller, more domestic version of exactly that same transition. The film's production geography contains its own layer of irony as well. The Breadwinner is, at its core, a deeply Nashville-coded story, built around Nate Bargatze's real-life Tennessee identity, filled with small regional touches like references to the Tennessee Titans, and marketed heavily around Bargatze's authentic Southern roots as part of what makes his comedic voice feel so genuine and relatable. Despite all of that carefully constructed regional identity, the film was not actually shot anywhere near Nashville, with production instead based primarily out of Trilith Studios in Fayetteville, Georgia, hundreds of miles away from the city the story is supposed to represent. A film whose entire cultural appeal rests so heavily on authentic, lived-in Southern identity was, in practice, manufactured almost entirely on soundstages and suburban neighborhoods in a completely different state, a fairly ordinary and unremarkable reality of modern film production driven by tax incentives and studio infrastructure, but one that stands in gentle, almost invisible tension with a film so heavily marketed around the idea of authentic regional identity and hometown pride. Perhaps the most financially resonant irony of the entire production involves the gap between the film's thematic message and its own underlying economic model. The Breadwinner tells a story that ultimately celebrates entrepreneurship, invention, and the value of building something honest and useful out of real-world necessity, with Katie Starminder positioned as a symbol of genuine, hard-won ingenuity born directly out of the everyday chaos of parenting. At the same time, multiple critics who reviewed the finished film specifically called out its unusually heavy and highly visible use of real-world brand integration, pointing to prominent, repeated appearances of major companies including Toyota, Walmart, and various named cereal brands woven directly into the story, with several reviewers speculating that this level of visible product placement likely helped offset a meaningful portion of the film's production budget. There is something quietly ironic about a story celebrating one family's small, homegrown business success while the film telling that story leans so heavily on financial support from some of the largest, most thoroughly corporate consumer brands in the country, a fairly common but rarely so visibly acknowledged tension running underneath a huge amount of modern studio filmmaking. Made only more noticeable here given how directly the film's own plot celebrates small-scale, independent, entrepreneurial success. The story's connection to Shark Tank produces its own layer of historical irony worth sitting with. Shark Tank built its entire cultural identity around celebrating scrappy, independent entrepreneurs pitching their own original ideas directly to individual wealthy investors, bypassing traditional corporate structures entirely in favor of a much more personal, direct path to funding and support. The Breadwinner borrows that exact cultural mythology to kick off its plot, using Katie's Shark Tank appearance as the spark that ignites her business and the entire story that follows. Yet the film built around that celebration of independent, scrappy entrepreneurial spirit was itself produced by one of the largest media conglomerates in the world, financed through the traditional corporate studio system, and partially funded, according to critical speculation, through exactly the kind of large-scale brand partnerships that stand in fairly direct tension with the scrappy, independent spirit the story's own inciting incident is designed to celebrate. The very same cultural mythology of small, independent success that the film borrows to get its story moving is, in a fairly direct sense, not how the film itself actually came to exist. The film's release date carries its own small but meaningful historical irony as well. The Breadwinner was originally announced with a planned release date in mid-March of 2026, a relatively quiet stretch of the release calendar that would have positioned the film as a gentle, low-pressure counter-programming option against a comparatively uncrowded slate of competing new releases. Sony ultimately chose to push that release date back significantly, repositioning the film to open over Memorial Day weekend at the very start of the crowded summer blockbuster corridor, a deliberate bet that Bargatz's massive existing fan base could help the film stand out even against much larger competing releases. Instead, the film found itself overshadowed on opening weekend not by a major studio blockbuster, but by a pair of low-budget horror films made by younger, internet-native filmmakers who had built their own audiences through online platforms rather than through traditional entertainment industry pathways. There is a distinct, layered irony in a film about an established, older model of American success. The traditional salesman-turned-reluctant homemaker moved into a bigger, higher-stakes release window specifically to compete for broader attention, only to be outpaced at the box office by filmmakers representing an entirely different, much newer model of building an audience and a career from the ground up. One built through direct online engagement rather than traditional studio-backed stardom, a changing of the entertainment guard playing out in real time on the very same opening weekend chart the film was hoping to conquer. Even the film's own historical genre lineage carries a quiet irony worth noting. The Breadwinner draws heavily, and quite openly according to multiple critics, on the basic comedic structure first popularized by Mr. Mom back in 1983, a film whose own premise was born directly out of the real economic anxieties of its era. Built around a husband losing his job amid broader industrial layoffs and being forced into a caretaking role out of financial necessity rather than opportunity. The Breadwinner inverts that original economic premise almost entirely, building its own story not around job loss and financial hardship but around a sudden, unexpected windfall of opportunity, Katie's own business success rather than any kind of setback forcing the family's roles to shift. A genre originally born out of recession-era anxiety about job loss has been quietly repurposed, more than 40 years later, into a story about the exact opposite economic experience, a story about sudden entrepreneurial opportunity rather than sudden unemployment, even while borrowing much of the original film's basic comedic shape and structure almost beat for beat. Finally, there is a broader, almost meta-level irony surrounding the entire cultural conversation that formed around the Breadwinner's release, one that extends well beyond the film itself into the larger industry discussion it became a part of. The movie was widely discussed and marketed as a potential test case for reviving the broad, wholesome, all-ages family comedy, a genre many industry observers had assumed was essentially extinct within modern theatrical releasing. Bargatz's own massive, historically successful clean comedy career made him an unusually strong candidate to potentially prove that theory correct. Yet the same qualities that made him such a strong candidate for that experiment, the safety, the broad accessibility, the deliberate absence of edge or controversy, became the exact target of the harshest critical responses once the film actually reached theaters, with reviewers repeatedly using words like safe, inoffensive, and defanged as criticisms rather than compliments. A film explicitly positioned as a referendum on whether wholesome, all-ages comedy still has a viable theatrical future ended up being criticized specifically for being too wholesome and too safe, a fairly striking irony sitting at the very center of the entire cultural experiment the film's release was designed to test in the first place. Regardless of how audiences themselves ultimately responded once they actually bought their tickets and sat down in the theater. Taken all together, these layers of irony, some embedded directly in the film's plot and structure, others emerging only once the finished movie collided with real-world critical reception, box office competition, and Bargatz's own career history, give The Breadwinner a strange kind of depth that exists almost entirely outside its own intended comedic content. A film about letting go of old roles that could not quite let go of a decades-old genre formula. A film about honest vulnerability that got criticized for feeling artificially safe. A film about small, independent entrepreneurial success financed partly through large-scale corporate brand deals. A film about authentic Southern identity filmed almost entirely somewhere else. None of these ironies were likely intentional on the part of the filmmakers, but taken together, they turned The Breadwinner into a genuinely interesting cultural artifact. A film whose real-world context ended up saying almost as much about the current state of Hollywood, comedy, and American family life as anything that actually happens on screen inside the story itself. If you enjoyed this look at the ironic and unexpected historical details hiding behind The Breadwinner, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves noticing these kinds of behind-the-scenes connections, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deep dive into the stories behind your favorite Hollywood movies.